Hello, hello everybody. Um, Good afternoon. First of all, allow me thank everyone who have registered for this seminar, as we are aware of how hectic times are at present, in addition to the multitude of academic events that take place at this time of year. So we are therefore very proud that you are here with us and have chosen to join us over the coming weeks to stay in our seminar. As you have noticed, this is the third edition of our seminar, The Local Impacts of China in Latin America, which I, Héctor Díaz from UNAM, have successfully organized together with Dr. Jaime Ortega from the UAM-Xochimilco with the support of the Center for China-Mexico Studies of the Faculty of Economics of UNAM, the UNAM-CINA, the SUAYET, and the Faculty of Social, Political Science of the UNAM. So, um, muchas gracias, buenas tardes por estar con nosotros. En primer lugar, permítame agradecerle a todas las personas que se han inscrito y que nos están acompañando. Somos conscientes de lo complejo que es la agenda académica en esta época del año y lo difícil que es sacar un espacio para poder encontrarnos y discutir algunos temas con la profundidad necesaria y que hayan decidido estar durante un tiempo con nosotros. Nos llena de mucho orgullo. Nos gusta saber que están con nosotros. Como han notado, esta es la tercera edición de nuestro seminario, Los impactos locales de China en América Latina, que hemos adelantado de manera exitosa, podríamos decir, ¿no? Un servidor que actualmente se encuentra adelantando su estancia postdoctoral en el Centro de Estudios China-México de la UNAM, y el doctor Jaime Ortega Reina de la UAM Xochimilco. En esta ocasión contamos con el apoyo del Centro de Estudios China-México de la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM China, del SUAYET, de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales, del Centro de Relaciones Internacionales. Entonces, sin más preámbulo, quisiera aprovechar, ¿no?, su presencia para presentar al primero de nuestros ponentes, ¿no? So, un paréntesis, como han notado, la presentación de hoy la vamos a hacer en inglés mayoritariamente, entonces las demás sesiones continuarán en español como lo hemos hecho los años anteriores, pero pues hoy haremos una excepción. Em, um, Finally, we like to express our sincere gratitude to our speakers today. The first of them, the Dr. Enrique Dussel Peters, coordinator of the CECHIMEX, and the Dr. Wang Hui, professor of the Tsingua University, who have agreed to present presentation on the first topic of our seminars, entitled Introduction to Contemporary Chinese Thought. The rules for participation are as follows. Each speaker will give a 25-minute presentation, followed by a discussion between the speakers and the audience, who will be able to submit their questions via the Zoom chat. With that said, I would like to introduce the first of our speakers today, the Dr. Enrique Dussel Peters. Dr. Enrique Dussel Peters have a PhD in economics at the University of Notre Dame in 1996. He is professor at the Graduate School of Economics de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México since 1993, coordinator of the Center of Chinese-Mexican Studies, CECHIMEX, of the School of Economics at UNAM, and of the Academic Network of Latin America and the Caribbean on China, RED ALC China, member of the Sistema Nacional de Investigadores de México, and he is also author of chapters of books from political economy, industrial organization, development process of segment of global value chains, and the socioeconomic Latin America and Caribbean-China relationship in Spanish, German, English, Chinese, and Portuguese. The rules for the presentations are, as I said, 25 minutes for each presentation. So, Professor Dussel, when you want to start, we are able to listen to you.
Okay, yes. So 25 minutes, good afternoon. It's a little bit strange, but we will hold this conversation in English. I'm very thankful for the invitation. Thank you very much, Héctor. Thank you very much also to Jaime Ortega Reina. And I am very much looking forward to hopefully having some kind of discussion and interaction also with Dr. Wang Hui from Tsinghua University. I will be in 10 days in Beijing, hopefully also in Tsinghua. What we agreed is 25 minutes to give a presentation on attempting to understand the contemporary Chinese thought, no? Can you see my presentation? ¿Se puede ver, Héctor? ¿Me confirmas?
No todavía, doctor.
No, dejar de compartir. A ver, ok, I go again. Yes, there I go. Compartir. Now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, okay. So my PowerPoint will be in Spanish. I will speak in English. I hope it works out. No? So what I want to do in these 25 minutes is to share with you some thoughts and some topics, a brief literature review, not review, but some literature that might be of interest for some of you, some background information of the very dynamic discussion that we are having in Latin America and the Caribbean on China. And I will probably not have enough time to develop the four concepts, but at least two of the concepts that I propose that I believe might be of interest in the discussion and for the course. No? So regarding references, I very much invite you to read the very recent document of CEPAL, or ECLAC in English, La Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe. It was published a few weeks ago. And then some other work, the recent document that I published at Lynn Reiner Publishers in English. I hope it will be translated into Chinese early next year. No? And of course, I invite you very much to go through the web pages of CECHIMEX and Red Académica de América Latina y el Caribe. Today, the network has 700 plus members from China, Latin America, and other parts of the world. No? We very recently, by the way, held, this might be of interest for Dr. Wang. We held very recently a 10 hours webinar with colleagues from Remintashue on the thought of President Xi Jinping, which can be downloaded from the webpage of our network. Very briefly, 3-4 minutes regarding current research on China in Latin America. No? First of all, China is generating massive employment in Latin America. This is a topic that few people in China and Latin America know. So China has generated more than 8 million jobs in Latin America in this long period, 95-2021. These 8.1 million jobs account for almost 15% of the employment generated in the region. This means 1 in 6 jobs in the region are related and associated with China. This is of utmost relevance for Latin America, by the way, also for China. In the reference in Cuadernos de Trabajo del CECHIMEX, you will find the full document by country for 45 sectors, etc. A second topic that I want to share is the information, and for more than 15 years that we've been working regarding Chinese investments in Latin America. We have a monitor of Chinese overseas foreign direct investment in Chinese, in English, and in Spanish since 2017. I invite you very much to go through some of these publications. Statistics matter. No, when you go through the data set we have generated according to public statistics, Secretaría de Economía in Mexico, China has invested 2.9 billion US dollars in Mexico. According to our statistics, almost 25 billion US dollars. No? So according to official statistics, China is the 17th most important investor in Mexico. According to our statistics, China is the 6th most important investor and growing very quickly. You will see lots of analysis from a macro, meso, micro, and territorial perspective. A third topic that I want to share with you is the importance, I will get back to this issue, the importance of infrastructure, of Chinese infrastructure in Latin America. So we have since 2020, 6 years now, a monitor of Chinese infrastructure in Latin America. The last one was published several weeks ago with a data set, with a group of analysis together with other institutions, case studies, national studies, the importance of infrastructure which is being used by hundreds of millions of Latin Americans, from metros to highways to ports to airports, etc., and the impact this is having on the everyday life in Latin America, which we believe is important. Two final topics. Latin America is also investing in China. So in this book, we examine at the end of 2023 15 translatinas, or major Latin American firms that have been investing for 15, 20 years in China with different successes. Very interesting, even for the Chinese audience, which was surprised to understand this. Finally, the issue of Latin American exports to China. This book was published in May of this year. The novelty and contribution of the document is that we focus on local experiences and challenges, which means cherries from Chile exported to China and the local impact in several countries. Camarones, I don't recall the name in English, shrimps from Ecuador, exported to China, and the local impact regarding environment, labor, transfer of technology, and other topics. 8 chapters on local impacts of Latin American exports. So finally, the topic I've been invited to talk, I would like to share with you 2 concepts that I believe are relevant for the work we have been doing. This is a result of 25 plus years working on China from a Latin American and Caribbean perspective, and particularly these concepts, I believe, are relevant in terms of not falling into the descriptive trap, which means when we discuss the development case of China in the last decades, since reforms and opening up since the 1970s, it is very easy to present graphs and charts on trade, on GDP, on exports, on science and technology, etc., with little explanation. The descriptive trap, I would say. No? So 2 concepts that I hope I can present with you. The first concept is the concept of the globalization process with Chinese characteristics. No? So the proposal of this concept is that, like no other country with the United States, today China has the aspiration of proposing a process of globalization since 2013 with the proposal of the One Belt, One Road initiative, originally, today the Belt and Road Initiative. No? So, as we will see in a moment, these concepts have impacts and implications. No? No other country, only the United States and China, have competing visions and proposals of a globalization process. Not Russia, not Brazil, not Turkey or other countries. What we are witnessing is a profound confrontation, as we will see, including a globalization process as we have been witnessing it since 1944, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions led by the United States, the European Union, and Japan. China proposes or has developed a group of regional institutions for Asia, for Africa, for Latin America. In Latin America, it is the CELAC China Forum. CELAC stands for la Cumbre de Estados Latinoamericanos y Caribeños, ¿no? The important participation of China in the G20 group, but also in BRICS. I would highlight, I always remember an old friend from Colegio de México, Alejandro Nadal, who wrote a beautiful article of why isn't BRICS being written with an M of Mexico, no? The most important thing is that BRICS is written with the C of China. In terms of GDP, of trade, of science and technology, the leader of BRICS is very clearly China. No? There is no qualitative comparison between China and the rest of BRICS, of G20, etc. There are a group of common concepts, relevant concepts, including the concept of a community with a common future. Very relevant is the issue of the time frame of cooperation for the global south. No? So China is proposing a cooperation framework until 2035, even until 2050 under the Belt and Road Initiative. This is not irrelevant if we compare it with the US proposal. No? What is today the time frame of cooperation of the Trump administration? No? Not 24 hours. No? This can change from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday. So since 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative as the umbrella institution that includes hundreds, if not thousands, of policies. No? We have the institutions regarding health, regarding environment, regarding education, academics, etc., all under this Belt and Road Initiative. President Xi Jinping has been presenting a group of global initiatives since 2021, the first one regarding global development, but also others. No? The main content, in my humble opinion, regarding this process of globalization with Chinese characteristics and Belt and Road Initiative is the concept of interconnectivity that I translate to infrastructure projects. And this is directly, explicitly linked to the development experience of China, the domestic experience of China since the end of the 1970s, in which infrastructure projects have become one important, I don't want to say the main important, but one important instrument to understand on the one hand, the eradication of absolute poverty in 2020, but secondly, also as an important instrument to allow for a technological upgrading process of Chinese firms. No? So the proposal of China in this process of globalization with Chinese characteristics are infrastructure projects. No? If the liberalization process of the United States focuses and is centered on the liberalization of goods, services, and capital, according to Stiglitz and Roderick and other authors, this liberalization process has benefited 1% of the global population. If you are benevolent, maybe 10% of the population. Infrastructure projects from this perspective, particularly in the global south, can have an impact on 99% of the population. No? Note competing globalization proposals. Interestingly, I will go a little bit more quickly, but I would simply highlight then that today and in 2025 and in the last 12 years, we have two competing globalization processes that will be extremely important today in 2025 and in the short and medium run in the confrontation between the US and China and in a discussion regarding a new global order. No? Two different proposals. I believe it is of utmost relevance in Latin America, at least, to understand in detail the specific proposal of China to the global south. It is very interesting, very surprising that political parties on the left and on the right, most of academics do not have a clue of what China and President Xi Jinping is proposing to the global south. No? I invite you to look at this seminar that we did together with Renmin University professors that refers to the specific proposals regarding economic issues, education, agriculture, technological development, among others. The 5 volumes of Xi Jinping on the governance and administration of China are very important. So one concept, a process of globalization with Chinese characteristics. I will get back to the topic at the end in my conclusions. A second topic that I would like to share with you, and I am looking forward to hear some criticisms or proposals by Professor Wang Hui. A second concept that I believe is important for understanding the contemporary political economy of China is the concept of the public sector in China. This concept runs against the concept of state-owned enterprises, state capitalism, and other concepts. In my book, you will find a full chapter only on this concept. So what is and I would highlight this, the proposal of this concept is a result of having examined in the last 20 plus years a lot of different global value chains in China: auto parts, automobiles, electronics, yarn, textile garments, footwear, among others, in which the public sector plays a fundamental role. How do I define the public sector in China? The public sector is the sum of the central government, cities, provinces, and municipalities. This is probably not that new. You have lots of other countries that have a federal political system. But this public sector has two very surprising and historically and from a contemporary perspective, two surprising important factors. On the one hand, you have an aggressive and in-depth competition within the public sector. This is surprising because in most of the Latin America and the world, there is not a competition within the public sector. I will refer to that in a moment. And the second factor that is important for understanding the public sector in China is the coordination of the Communist Party of China, which has hundreds of institutions from the State Council to institutions at the county level or municipal level, cities, provinces, and the central government. This public sector today, in the 2020s, has the property of around 40% of China's GDP. China being the largest economy of the world, according to the IMF, and measured in GDP. No? 40% of the property of China's GDP is accounted by this public sector. This goes far beyond SASAC, which is a public institution in China that is the umbrella institution for 117, 118 firms. This is the way I am defining the public sector in China. What does this mean, among other things? Among other things, this means that, for example, in the automobile sector, I've been working in detail in the last years on the topic. In the automobile sector, China is producing today 35 million cars, no? Mainly fossil cars, not taking into account electric cars. The United States, 10, 12 million cars. China has all multinational corporations that you can imagine, from Europe to the US, to Korea, Japan, etc., with joint ventures, most of the cases with Chinese firms. 50% today of domestic sales in China, no, sorry, not domestic sales, but 50% of production of automobiles in China are being produced by Chinese brands, no? And within the Chinese brands, the most important are public firms, no? So when you see who are the major producers of cars today in China, the main producer is BAIC. What does BAIC stand for? BAIC stands for Beijing Automotive Industrial Corporation. But BAIC produces more cars than all of Mexico together. The second producer in China is SAIC, Shanghai Automotive Industrial Corporation. The competition between BAIC, SAIC, and several dozens of other public firms is enormous, no? Very interesting anecdotes by Volkswagen and other multinational corporations that arrived to China and were very surprised by the high level of competition. So the public sector, the omnipresence of the public sector, is reflected in the property of the public sector. From this perspective, debates and discussions on industrial policy in China, as they are very fashionable today in Latin America, are not very intelligent. A city such as Beijing today accounts for more than 30,000 public firms, one of them being BAIC, and tens of thousands others. And does Beijing do an industrial policy? The question does not understand the issue of the public property in China. The city of Beijing does industrial policy, R&D policies, financing policies, cultural policies, etc., links its universities with its banks, development banks, firms of the property of the public sector, etc. From this perspective, I am running out of time. From this perspective, the public sector in China is probably the most important institution in China to understand the enormous growth and development of China in the last 45 years since reform and opening up. I will go and run to the conclusions. No, this one here. So based on these concepts, we have been doing in the last 10 or 15 years very detailed analysis on trade, investment, infrastructure, financing, etc., within China and in its relationship between China and Latin America and the Caribbean. If we do not understand these concepts, the competition between two globalization options and the importance qualitatively and quantitatively, the importance of the public sector in China, the analysis in most of the cases will fall into this descriptive trap. No? I leave it here. I think I have talked 25 minutes and 42 seconds, so I leave it there, and I simply again invite you to participate in the ongoing discussions in Latin America on China. We have lots of tierra incognita, of unknown events, socioeconomic events in China and in its relationship to Latin America, but it is important to understand that in institutions such as CECHIMEX and Red ALC China, you will find a very rich environment with hundreds of researchers, including friends and colleagues from China, also from Tsingua University, that have been working on these topics. No? Thank you very much, Héctor.
Thanks to you, Profesor Dussel. Muchas gracias, Profesor Dussel, por su magnífica presentación. Nos ha ubicado perfectamente en el contexto de lo que significan los actuales desarrollos de una globalización con características chinas. Very thank you to you, Professor Dussel, for your interesting presentation, who introduced to us perfectly to the characteristics of this globalization with Chinese characteristics. So we will now move to this afternoon's second speaker, Dr. Wang Hui, whom I will introduce now. Wang Hui received his PhD from the Chinese Academy of Social Science in 1988. He is director of the Tsingua Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Science. Wang Hui is one of the first distinguished professors of Arts, Humanities, and Social Science at Tsingua University and serves as a doctoral supervisor at the university's Department of Chinese Language and Literature and the Department of History. He was also appointed Shangqian Distinguished Professorship by the Ministry of Education of China. His research interests includes Chinese intellectual history, modern Chinese literature, and social and political theory. Please, Professor Wang, can you start when you are ready?
Okay, thank you very much. It's my great honor and a great pleasure to be here and share some ideas with all of you. And I look forward to hearing back from your comments. And I'm an intellectual historian, focused on the Chinese history. And in my today's presentation, I think I will focus on the two characteristics of 20th century China. And I think that sometimes from the global perspective, 20th century was so specific for the great transformation. I will talk about these two things. I think that there were two inventions in the 20th century. That first of all is the emergence and the decline of the socialist state in the 20th century. Socialist movement was started from 19th century, together with the rise of the industrialization and the capitalist system. But the socialist state is really the new thing happened in the 20th century. Second, I think that there was that from the national liberation movements toward the third worldism and decolonization, third worldism, and now we talk about the global south. These massive transformation was also happened, started from the 20th century. I will briefly sketch some ideas on this issue. Basically, the 19th century Europe is the central axis of modern historical narration. Many historical and theoretical discussions, whether about the classical period, the Middle Age, the early modern period, or the 20th century, and the post eras, are mostly reconstructed according to the historical view and the problem consciousness of Europe's 19th century. The 19th century and the concept of modernity almost completely overlapped, rooted in the dual revolutions, the French and the British Industrial Revolution. And the narrative of capitalist modernity with Europe's revolutions, capital and empires, and their fluctuation forming the central story, changes in other regions of the world are subordinated to this central story. Compared to the long 19th century, the 20th century remains a brief age of so-called extremes from the European perspective. World War I, World War II, ethnic cleansing and the Cold War, tyranny, and so on and so forth are all the social experiments that ended in failure. So that I think, for example, the Eric Hobsbawm once lamented that the 20th century is intimately linked with the fate of the single country, the Soviet Union. In such narratives, what position do China and other non-Western worlds occupy? So that's the one of the issues. The rise of imperialism, the pattern of the great powers both competing and collaborating to divide up colonial territories, and the shift of the global power center to the Pacific constitute historical conditions needed to be understand the fundamental issues of the 20th century. From China's perspective, if we speak only of the phenomenon of imperialism, it is difficult to draw a boundary today as clear as that drawn by many classical writers on imperialism between the 1840 and 1870. Alongside the shift of the world capitalist center, the birth of the 20th century was accompanied by a series of revolutions in peripheral areas. Imperialism is not only an international system, but also a military, economic, political, social, and cultural system that infiltrates societies internally. What clearly distinguishes 20th century from the 19th century are the revolutions in the non-Western areas, which were nurtured by the internal and external conditions of the imperialist era. The novelty of this new period is not merely defined by the developmental story that capitalism spread from the central areas to the global stage. Rather, it was also shaped, on the one hand, by the colonies and the semi-colonies' continued resistance against the imperialist hegemony of economic development, as well as their struggle for political independence and cultural survival. And on the other hand, by the transformations of the internal social relations that obstructed both the goals and the exploration of new social forms in this process of resistance and transformation. For example, in the age of war and the revolutions, to understand the transformation of the 20th century China through the war itself, it is necessary to ask what the characteristics of the warfare of this era in China were. I think that from the whole 20th century, the wars, like the North expenditure in the 1920s, the agrarian revolution, the Communist Revolution War from late 20s to the 30s, the war of resistance against the Japanese aggression and the Liberation War in the 1940s, the wars before the 20th century, such as the Opium War, Sino-French War, Sino-Japanese War, have significantly differences. There were conflicts of revolutionary organizations mobilized in warfare, conflicts of revolution waged through the warfare, and fights to build a revolutionary country during the warfare, struggles to create a new political subject of the people through the warfare. In any case, that was different from 19th century wars. That was a war combined with the revolution. In China, it's mainly the land revolution. So 20th century China was born within this context. Because of this, the 20th century is likely not, as Eric Hobsbawm suggested, solely defined by a single country, that so-called Soviet Union, but rather is linked to the revolutions in the peripheral areas and their sequential consequences. To discuss the starting and the ending points of the 20th century is thus to explore the multiple origins, convoluted processes, and the declining form of these eras' revolutionary waves. Analysis of this issue must begin with analysis of the non-uniformity of the imperialist system. If the non-uniformity of the imperialist world system creates the weakening of this international system, then domestic divisions caused by the competition among major powers also provide the weak link for the domestic revolution. Thus, in the era of imperialism, there were two types of the weak links. One type of weak link, as Lenin said, is an uneven economic and political development as an absolute law of capitalism. So these are the, but on the other, it's uneven economic and political development as an absolute law of capital, leading to the conclusion that the victory of socialism is possible first in several or even in one capitalist country alone. Another weak link arises from the uneven political and economic development domestically, as well as the contradictions among the imperialist agents within the oppressed nations. The second weak link provided the conditions for Chinese revolutionary force to survive and develop in a vast countryside along the provincial borders and in peripheral areas. I perceive the short 20th century as a century of revolutions. These revolutionary century didn't originate from the establishment of economic and military hegemony in Europe or the United States, but from the new non-uniformity caused by the process of establishing such hegemony, or more precisely from the revolutionary opportunities created by this non-uniformity, which consists of a series of interconnected major events, national, political, and social revolutions. The Russian, for example, the Russian-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, directly triggered 1905 Russian Revolution, which inspired a massive strike by the Polish Socialist Party and a loss insurrection in the same year, affecting the Persian Constitutional Revolution, 1905 to 1911, and the Turkish Revolution, 1908 to 1909. Maybe we should say that the revolution in Mexico, 1910. These revolutions, together with the 1911 Chinese Revolution, formed a revolutionary sequence in Asia, mainly, and East Europe. the October Revolution of 1917 in Russia and the 1924 nationalist revolution in China under the First United Front, which can also be placed within this revolutionary sequence, provided the premise for the land revolution, so a moment led by the CCP at that time. The October Revolution is usually understood in the context of European warfare, but this overlooks the continuity between this revolution and the Asian revolutionary sequence. Closely related to this sequence are the decolonization and the national independence movements that developed in different forms in different countries and regions, such as India independence movement. Though all of these revolutions and movements took place in different historical and cultural contexts, constituting different modern paths, their interconnections and the mutual inspirations are apparent. Years later, these revolutions and movements were part of the historical foundation of the Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement from 1950s to the 1960s. Therefore, the birth of the short 20th century had to begin with the exploration of the weaklings, which can only be identified within the search for opportunities for revolution and change. From the vantage point of seeking opportunities for revolution and change, it is not the old Euro-Asian geopolitical competition, but the revolutionary situation caused by the new structure in Asia after the Sino-Japanese War and the Russian-Japanese War, not the imperialist wars, but the so-called Lenin defined as an awakening of Asia, triggered by these wars and shaped by the aforementioned series of revolutions that marked the multiple beginnings of the so-called short 20th century. Therefore, temporally speaking, the short 20th century didn't begin in, like Eric Hobsbawm said, in 1914, the beginning of the World War I, but rather between the 1905 to the 1920s, maybe, or 1911. Especially, it didn't start at a single point, but from a set of beginnings. And in terms of opportunity, it arose not from the destructive wars, but from the dual exploration that sought to break through the imperialist system and older regimes. Geopolitically, 20th century was not just a post-colonial era, but also a post-metropolitan era, during which revolutions and reforms in peripheral areas not only transformed their own regions, but also the central peripheral relations of the world, significantly affecting the central regions and the transformations they experienced. It is only recently, at a time when the countries of Global South account for nearly 60% of global GDP and the BRICS countries over 30%, that people have begun to understand the features of the post-metropolitan era, though this is a prolonged process. The widely used geopolitical concepts, transcontinental continentalism, the surge of national independence movements and the non-aligned movements, and the emergence of the Global South along this trajectory all stem from this sequential revolutionary process. What is the Global South? The South is not just a region or merely backward or impoverished the area. In the tradition of the Bandung Conference, it resonates with the East, forming unity through the differences. China and the Global South are no longer merely peripheral areas totally dominated by colonial metropoles of the colonial era. They are the epochal forces that prepare the transition from metropolitan era to the post-metropolitan era. These processes began a century ago and is one of the premises for understanding the 21st century. How many minutes I still have, or just finished?
You still have 10 minutes, Professor.
2 minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for that. That's great. If one of the global characteristic of 20th century was the revolutions emerging in the peripheral regions outside the center of the global capitalism, then these series of revolutions also signified the emergence of the new political subjects in global relations, successively called oppressed nations, non-aligned movement, the Third World, and the Global South, based on different historical conditions. The nations and the peoples under these designations differed tremendously across various historic conditions and cultural backgrounds. As Indonesian President Sukarno stated at the opening ceremony of the Bandung Conference in 1955, the participating nations have not gathered together in a world of peace and unity and cooperation. Great chasms yawn between nations and groups of nations. Our unhappy world is torn and tortured, and the peoples of all countries walk in fear lest, through no fault of theirs, the dogs of war are unchained once again. Decades later, contradictions still abound across nations, religions, ethnic groups, classes, genders, and between the humanity and the nature, forming a chain of crisis. The historical foundation of neoliberal globalization lies in the multiple monopolies formed during the era of imperialism and the Cold War, including finance, technology, and natural resources, weapons of mass destruction, and communication. From the industrial and the electronic revolutions to the biotechnological and the digital revolutions, these global order and its inherent inequalities increasingly fair to meet development needs of China and Asian regions, provide support for further development in African and Latin American countries, or offer a new framework for fair global development and overcoming ecological crises. If the oppressed nations, the Third World, and the non-aligned movement were responses to the imperialism and hegemonic politics, the Global South today must address a chain of crises brought about by neoliberal globalization and advocate for a new political, economic, and cultural relationship and a new international order that accommodated the rise of peripheral regions. Comparing to the international conjuncture during the Bandung era with that of today, the most significant difference or the development is the rise of China and other peripheral regions, which through the revolution and the transformation has partially changed the hegemonic structure of the global order. From the Bandung era onwards, hegemonic persisted, but was loosening in a way that was difficult to restrain. If the crisis of war in the colonial era stemmed from the conflicts among the imperialist nations, vying for colonies' sphere of influence and the so-called balance of power, today's greatest threats to peace arises from efforts to suppress the rise of peripheral regions as hegemonic structure have begun to loosen. Following the World War II, countries in the Global South, including the East, gained basic conditions for modernization through national liberation and the socialist revolution. With these foundations, some countries and the regions have made significant progress through the independent and the cooperative development and continuously seek a fairer order in global processes. Accompanied by internal and external crises, Global North countries have shifted from neoliberal globalization to more overt containment and the monopoly and the regional war crisis have the potential to escalate into large-scale global conflicts. The financial trade, technology restrictions, and the sanctions repeatedly imposed by United States and the European Union are manifestations of a hegemonic crisis. Global North countries can no longer monopolize natural resources as in the colonial era, even in terms of weapons of mass destruction and the media. The monopoly of hegemonic nations is in decline. The issue of defending peace that was raised at the Bandung Conference presents a new urgency and different implications in the context of the new era. Today, the more intense contemporary conflicts are closely related to the internal changes within the five monopoly structure: finance, technology, natural resources, weapons of mass destruction, and the communications. These five monopoly in the early Cold War era and the post-Cold War era now transformed in each that the hegemony, the absolute domination was loosened, declined. So the danger before was mainly came from the absolute domination of the five monopoly. Now its danger was because they now cannot control these, dominated these monopoly, but try to effort to maintain that hegemony. I think I should stop here and for the further interaction.
A lot of thanks, Professor Wang, for your interesting presentation. So, finish this part. We can start the question and ask section. I don't know. We have a lot of questions in the chat section. So, if you are agree, I can start with a few questions that the chat meeting are presenting us just now, and also with a few questions that I have for you too about your presentations. Muchas gracias, doctor Wang, por su presentación. Vamos a dar así pie a la segunda sección de nuestro evento, que es la sección de preguntas y respuestas a los ponentes, donde leeré las preguntas que están en la sección del chat, así como haré algunas preguntas o dudas que a mí en calidad de moderador me surgieron acerca de sus fascinantes presentaciones. Entonces, comenzaré con una serie de preguntas, dos muy breves, una para el doctor Dussel y otra para el doctor Wang. So I will start with two questions, one for Dr. Dussel and the other one for the Professor Wang that I have about your presentations. So, Professor Dussel, you talk us about the globalization process with Chinese characteristics, no? And you develop a kind of characteristics of this kind of globalization, certainly differently about the other process of globalization that we have in the past. In this structure, you start to present the role of the constructions, the construction of buildings in the global south. And I would like to ask you, what is the role of the Chinese public statement in this process of development of the construction buildings in the global south? And for the Professor Wang, you tries a long discussion, as is properly to the intellectual history, to think the development of the the Chinese modern thought to think it in a long-term duration. In this way, I have a question because if we have China today, the common people usually think in a very technological advanced society. And in this way, I would like to ask you for the role of the technology in the talk, in the mind of the first communists in China, and how this notion of technology could be different to the sense that the technology have in the mind of the main philosopher of the members of the Communist Party today. What's the role of the technology? These two questions, and then we start with the chat room questions. Please, Professor Dussel.
Okay, I mean, I have read the questions in the chat, and we can continue with them later, no? But regarding your question, Héctor, the role, let's, if you, like I do, highlight the importance of infrastructure projects in this globalization process with Chinese characteristics as a main instrument for the global South, it is very important to understand the details of these infrastructure projects. No, this is why we have been preparing every year since 2020 this monitor of Chinese characteristics, this monitor of Chinese infrastructure projects in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a lot of work. You can find the data set, almost 300 infrastructure projects by China in Latin America and the Caribbean. I could give a long presentation of what are these infrastructure projects, but I would highlight in general that there are no general recipes regarding Chinese infrastructure projects in Latin America. More than 90%, 92% of Chinese infrastructure projects in Latin America are generated in Latin America by public firms. This is why the concept of public firms is fundamental. There is no other country in the world in which the public sector is so important regarding regarding infrastructure projects, not European countries, not Korea, not Japan, not the United States. No, so the relevance of the public sector is fundamental. No, and by the way, as part of this Belt and Road Initiative, as an umbrella institution, you have, as I highlighted, hundreds of other policies, instruments, the Silk Road, no? The Silk Road in education, from a digital perspective, in health, in education, etc., etc. The public sector here, when you see the infrastructure projects, is fundamental. No? China today is offering financing, technology, but also it can construct infrastructure projects all over the world, also in Latin America. And by the way, if the Latin American counterpart and country allows it and signs an agreement, this is always with a written agreement, China is able to offer labor power from China, and the food can come from China. No, the tacos can come from China, and the tequila can come from China if the Latin American part agrees with this. But this is not a general recipe. We have more than 300 infrastructure projects, and in several cases, you have the same Chinese firm operating very differently in Costa Rica, Mexico, Brazil, and Peru. No? So welcome to a detailed analysis on Chinese infrastructure projects in Latin America. It's not an ideological process. It's an empirical work where you have to see details regarding differences. The same firm doing dozens of infrastructure projects all over Latin America with very different characteristics. Very unfortunately, very few institutions, academics in Latin America, by the way, neither in China, do such a detailed work. So it is very easy to fall into ideological discussions, not having a clue of what, not having visited once a Chinese infrastructure project in Latin America. No? I leave it there. Thank you, Héctor.
Okay, it sounds like a country made by engineers instead than intellectuals. So, Professor Wang, please.
You mean the question of technology, right? That in China. I'm not a specialist on this issue, but I would like to say something, and especially maybe I can cite some people's the research to think about that. Not so long ago, I just read a long interview by the Louisa Liu and in South China Morning Post, and in which she talked something on the Chinese technological innovation. Because we know in the West, we're talking about like a Peter Thiel, that the broadly cited, say, from 0 to 1, that was the Western invention, that only China and other countries only follow that. But in that long interview that Louisa Liu mentioned that he tried to compare so-called 0 and 1, he outlined the 4 types of innovation in China. He talked about the 4 types. First is that China often turns 1 into so-called 1.1, and on a massive scale. The scale is matter. With over 1.4 billion people, China can sell to the rest of the world, which has over 8 billion people, a huge market. That's why. Therefore, if China achieves 1.1, it has the potential to expand to the 8.8 billion. That was his calculation, her calculation. She gave one example. Do you know the Ant Group, Alibaba? I think a lot of people will know that big company. Ant Group is an example. It originated with the launch of Alipay in 2004, and 6 years after the PayPal, but it then began adding its own features, services, and products, and then scaled up. Small in scale, but numerous in number, as the name of Ant suggests. That, I think, the Alipay was integrated into the Ant Group in October 2014. In just 6 years, the company's market capitalization reached the 310 billion in dollars in its 2020 IPO. So that's one of the you give it the so-called from 1 to 1.1, so massively technology, and also based on the large scale population and so on and so forth. These were she outlined one the characteristic. The second is innovation model is based on improving and upgrading existing technologies. Take for example, DeepSeek. As an example, this company, founded only 2 years ago, sparked the widespread discussion online in January of this year, quickly becoming the focus of the industry. Its core technology uses a computing architecture completely different from ChatGPT, resulting in higher computational efficiency and lower costs. Although OpenAI is the original developer of ChatGPT, DeepSeek has taken a different approach to technical implementation, potentially achieving the super results. So this is a second issue. We can see the third innovation she described is the integration of multiple independent elements into a whole. Take the WeChat. We use that WeChat as an example, where its parent company, Tencent, initially launched the QQ. It borrowed operating model of ICQ. Over time, so while the platforms like Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram emerged in Silicon Valley, WeChat achieved the multi-platform integration. Users can not only shop as conveniently as Amazon, but also easily hail a ride through the Uber, making it a model that was a Didi in China's Didi, the model of multifunctional innovation. It's practically usable like a Windows system because it's a platform for everything. So the many people here today no longer even use Baidu search, but directly use WeChat because WeChat has become an information universe. So this is a third type of the innovation. The fourth type of innovation, the Louisa Liu talk about, is focused on 0.1 within the one, making these core element industry benchmark and promoting it across the various fields. That I think it's another, like take the CATL as an example. This company doesn't produce complete vehicle, but focus on developing the key 1.1 component, the battery. As the world's largest battery supplier, it supply 1/3 of the world's electrical vehicles. And Tesla is also a major consumer. Last year, CATL successfully complete the test flight of an electrical aircraft and launched an electrical cruise ship. So I think that I just briefly summarize some ideas here, try to use this example to think about the so-called the long process of declining process of the 5 monopolies by the West. So that's why they launched the trade war, they launched the sanction, they launched the prohibition for exportation on the new high technology, and so on and so forth. So you know that now the China and America and the EU were on the intense competition and the negotiation on these kind of the issues. Sometimes it's almost the people use the concept of war to define these kind of the phenomena. I think this is a really the examples. So I just talk about these technological issue is that the one of the crucial issues in contemporary world.
Thank you, Professor Wang. So, voy a leerle a los ponentes 3 preguntas en línea de los que tenemos en el chat para que puedan sintetizar una respuesta para poder evacuar, para poder dar voz, ¿no? A las personas que nos están acompañando, que son la razón de ser de este evento. I will read the questions that they are in the chat room. So I will read 3 questions for the Professor Dussel and then 3 questions for you, Professor Wong, and then you have the opportunity to ask to them. So, Professor Dussel, ¿qué puede, dentro de lo posible, replicar México sobre el proyecto chino, priorización del sector público, y qué reformas institucionales serían necesarias para que se concretara? Es la pregunta de Ana Laura León. La segunda, the second one is, ¿Cómo contribuyen los análisis desde América Latina, especialmente desde México, a una comprensión más plural de la globalización con características chinas? Es la pregunta de Annie. Y Ashley Soel pregunta, what sectors of the industry do you think have more opportunity to grow between Latin America and China? And she also have another question. What's your perspective about Chinese state-owned construction companies on Latin America? And for you, Professor Wang, the Professor Wang Hui asks you about the connections between the Mexican Revolution and their influence in the revolutionary process in Asia, particularly thinking the 1911 revolution in China, I guess. And Maria Fernanda Romero, the Maestra Romero said, asks you from the modern Chinese thought, what is the importance to study the history of Mexico from China? Because every day there's more historians than Chinese historians that travel to Mexico to develop their investigations in a comparative perspective. And for you, the third question, Professor Wang, how can global South countries cope with the change of rules in a system that has historically not favored them, but that they still have to follow and adapt and reform their systems to the hegemonic order? And now it seems uncertain. So, Professor Dussel and Professor Wang, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Héctor, and also to the assistants. Briefly, the first question by Ana Laura, no, regarding the options of replicating the public sector in other places of the world. No? This is exactly the discussion we are having a course on China at the Instituto Nacional de Formación Política of Morena in Mexico, no? Which is the most, from a quantitative perspective, the biggest political party of Latin America and the Caribbean. No? This is exactly a question, no? Not from a primitive perspective where you can copy and paste the Chinese experience. That would be a joke. No? But yes, the question is, do political parties, which are apparently in the center left of the political spectrum, no? Can political parties, such as Morena, for example, today, begin discussing the topic of property? No? After 40 years of neoliberalism in most of Latin America, including Mexico, the issue of property has completely disappeared. I understand very well your question, Ana Laura.
Professor, you are mute.
I've been talking for 1 or 2
For 10
minutes.
seconds.
Okay. So I understand very well, Ana Laura, your question regarding institutional reforms, but I would go one step back in terms of, is there a political and economic consensus in which the issue of property is relevant, or are we going to have a defensive stance regarding two public firms in Mexico, Comisión Federal de Electricidad and Pemex, which are both technically bankrupt? No? Can we imagine that Mexico City fabricates electrical autonomous cars in the future with these two components, competition from the beginning and coordination from the beginning? Can we imagine this or not? I have not seen any kind of discussion on this, neither in Brazil, nor in Chile, nor in Mexico. No? what is the contribution of Latin America, Annie, no? The contribution of Latin America to a discussion in China? Well, I don't know. I've been 50, 70 times in China discussing these topics with colleagues at Tsingua, at Peita, at ILAS, of CAS, but also in Shanghai University, etc. And we are pushing our Chinese friends in terms of inviting them to discuss some of these reflections from a Latin American perspective. No, you can analyze China from a Beijing perspective in Tsinghua, no, but you can do this also in Mexico City or in Berlin, and you will come up with very different results. No, so in this case, the proposal is to have a dialogue with Chinese colleagues and trying to explain them how we in Latin America and the Caribbean experiment the increasing presence of China in the region, no? And welcome to a debate, to a discussion. Sometimes we do not agree, but that's not relevant. No, I think it is important to enrich this kind of discussions. No, finally, I believe that the concepts of the public sector in China, the concept of a globalization process with Chinese characteristics, the concept I did not present it of new triangular relationship, which is based on the confrontation between the US and China, and how do third regions and countries react, they have important implications. In my humble opinion, these very fashionable discussions, no, on geopolitics and geoeconomics and the multipolar world, in my humble opinion, they are pretty useless. Today, what we are witnessing is a confrontation between the two major economies, between the US and China. I humbly believe that Russia does not have anything to do at that level, neither India or Brazil or other countries. So many colleagues in international relations and in other places hide behind the concept of geoeconomics and geopolitics and the new Cold War, etc. And they, in many cases, they are pretty ignorant of what is going on in the United States, what is going on in China, and what are the details of the confrontation, the systemic confrontation between the US and China. Welcome to a debate. No? Thank you, Héctor.
Mhm.
Thank you to you, Professor Dussel. Professor Wang, please.
Yeah, I understand the first. Can you explain a little bit the second question? I didn't completely got it. Can you talk about the second question? That what's the point of that? I didn't hear clearly.
Okay, the second question. What is the importance to study the history of Mexico from China? Because every day there's more historians, Chinese historians, who travel to Mexico to study the revolutions in in a comparative way.
These are first or the second?
This is the second.
The second. The first is also talking about the
Yes,
Mexico,
is
right?
also
Yeah.
about.
Okay. So this is a really not maybe the Fernando Weiran can help me to explain more. He know much better than me about the Mexico and Latin America. But as I know that the first question is that the how when we talk about the early revolutions in the first decade of the 20th century, and we used to use that term, so-called the Asia Awakening or Awakening Asia, that a series of the revolutions happened in these regions. But on the other hand, we also realize that the Mexico Revolution also happened and almost spontaneously. Obviously, partly because you can think about that the period of the expansion of that the so-called imperialism. And if you think about the connection, that what I can only one example I can talk about in the late 1920s, when the CCP movement and the retreat from the urban area to the countryside in Jinggangshan in the Jiangxi province. And they even established a new central bank. This is a communist moment, the central bank for those so-called the areas they occupied. And interestingly enough, they issued the new coins, the money. The design of the cover of that coin was completely came from the Mexico Revolution. However, that they add the one Chinese characters. It was a labor or the worker inside the Chinese character inside it, but the whole designing of the coin was really came from the Mexico coin that issued by revolutionary government. So this is a kind of for me is a interesting connection and interaction. And the designer itself, I think is Xu Teli who was appointed as the first banker of the Revolutionary Bank. He was thought as a teacher of Mao in the early years. So these are kind of the early connections. That's what I can say that for the first question. Second, I think that actually we know that most, especially the last 40 years, Chinese reform, open door policy, so-called opening policy, was much more towards the West, especially from the late 70s down to the 90s, was really from there. So the whole generation, different early years, that even the condition was really limited. Introduction and the translation of Latin American culture and Mexico culture and the literature was still a lot in the 1950s to the 1970s. But afterwards, of course, the translations were continued. But generally speaking, the intellectual or the spatial work on the Mexico studies, American studies was still marginal. Nowadays, I think the more and more people pay attention to that region, partly because you can see that the idea of the so-called global South emerged in China is massively. So many people talk about that. A lot of the conference organized for this topic. That's why a lot of people move to this direction. And I think there's one phenomena was that, for example, more than decades ago, I was the chief editor of Dushu magazine. At that time, I also invite some scholars to write about the Latin America. And few of them were talking about Mexico, were specialists. But now a lot of discussions about the global South is not only limited to the specialists, but the intellectuals, when they're talking about China, they also make its connection or the relation, not only to Mexico, but to the Latin America and Africa. That was a new tendency. But generally speaking, the knowledge about Mexico and Latin America was still very limited. So in these regards, we really need to do more work. We hope that we will have more opportunities and set up the new platforms and the channels for the communication with the scholars, activists, from Mexico and Latin America.
Thank you, Professor. We are going to read the last round of questions in the same way. I will start with the questions for the Professor Dussel. Soto Concepción Isaía le pregunta por el papel de Rusia, en la actualidad creo que ya lo tocó, y en la misma lógica, si los BRICS son una estrategia, una herramienta mejor para el soft power chino. Rubén Arturo le pregunta por el impacto del desarrollo de la ruta de la seda en el cambio climático. Em, Ulises le pregunta al doctor Dussel cuáles son los 5 sectores de la monopolización. No sé si lo puede responder. También para el doctor Dussel, que si cree que sea posible, comente el volumen de importaciones chinas y en México, yo creo que sería exportaciones chinas hacia México a partir de commodities o alimentos, o de importaciones mexicanas en China, mejor. Adara Díaz, ok, eso es para el profesor Wang. Para el profesor Dussel, la última pregunta, que si puede repetir por favor el nombre de las 2 compañías de autos que mencionó. Y listo. And for you, Professor Wang, Soto Isaiah asks you for the current perception of the historical legacy of the Western imperialism among the young Chinese, particularly the Japanese imperialism. So, Rubén Arturo, no, eso era por el profesor Dussel. No, quedó. Adara Díaz asks you, Professor Wang, how challenging is the American trade aggression led by Donald Trump for the development of China and Latin America relations? So, okay, that's all the questions that we have in the chat room. And please, Professor Dussel and then Professor Wang, and that's all for today.
Right. Again, thank you very much for the questions. I again invite you very much, if you're interested on topics related to China by itself, but also related to hundreds of different topics related to Latin America and specific countries, regions, etc. Please take a look at the web pages of CECHIMEX and Red ALC China. You will find a very rich research together with Chinese colleagues and from other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. So again, I don't have anything against Russia. No, we have, if you look at the cycle of conferences we have had in the last 10 years, several very interesting conferences from Russian colleagues regarding the strategic association between Russia and China in the last 30 years. Very important to understand the details. This has been going on for 30 years, etc. But I very humbly believe that Russia is not at the economic, political level at the discussion of a globalization process. Russia is not at the level of neither the United States nor of China. Maybe tomorrow, no? But today, no, and neither India or other countries. And so this invites us to focus on the US, on China, and on their systemic confrontation. I would understand the Silk Road as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative as the umbrella institution of which the Silk Road is part. No? So you have this digital Silk Road, the health Silk Road, dozens of different Silk Routes in the last 10 years, 10 plus years. Of course, the Silk Road that historically went from Xi'an to Venice and back, no, does not ride on camels, no, but it could ride on fast speed trains made in China with Chinese technology, financing, etc., etc. No? So welcome to technological, financial options, etc. No? The names of these automobile firms is BAIC, B-A-I-C, Beijing Automotive Industrial Corporation, and SAIC, Shanghai Automotive Industrial Corporation. These are not the only public firms in the automobile sector in China. You have several dozens of others, but they are good examples how the public sector can be very competitive. Ask other transnational corporations that are competing with them within China and in other parts of the world, how they are competing. No? I always remember we have at these cuadernos de trabajo, el CECHIMEX, we have a very interesting analysis of our dear colleague Loretta Napoleoni, no? And she asks herself, how is it possible that the Communist Party of China generates firms that are more competitive than the Western firms? No? Welcome to a discussion. No? So these are not firms. China does not have anything to do with the Soviet Union of the 1950s and 1960s. No? Nothing to do with the Cold War or a new Cold War. No? I would say let the Soviet Union rest in peace. No? And let's learn and do a lot of work to understand a little bit of contemporary China. No? Thank you.
Thanks to you, Professor. Professor Wang, please.
Okay. Imperialism, this is the long history that from mid-19th century up almost the whole 20th century was really there. So the historical memory, obviously, is very deep. It's not that easy to disappear and forgettable. It's not. But obviously, as Professor Dussel said, that now it's totally different situation. And that was even you talk about the World War II, talk about the the Japanese aggression war and so on and so forth. So if you look at the popular culture, the soap opera, still a lot of the stories happened during that period. But generally speaking, that was more or less the historical issues. However, in this region, in East Asia, I think that one of the issue is the continuity of that from that period down to now. The whole structure not necessarily completely gone. For example, we know that the Sino-Japanese relations are a big issue, but mainly it's because of the America issue. You know, the Okinawa was one of the biggest, largest military base in Northeast Asia. And a lot of the wars, Afghanistan war, and those jets, the fight was started from there. So it's very close to China. And also in Korean Peninsula, is American military existence heavily there. That was a continuation from the early history of the Cold War. Didn't change. So that's, and also new allocation of military, the bases there. So you can see that why those historical issue between China and Japan was always happened again, became the contemporary issue, partly because these Cold War structure, in a way, was still there. So these were the precondition to think about the issue of the contemporary regional conflicts in those areas. I think that it's still the one of the big issues. Secondly, I think that maybe we also need to think about, I already mentioned in my talk briefly, that basically two Chinese, I think that the two characters of the Chinese history, that the 20th century history, I always try to argue that the first characteristics of 20th century China happened in the beginning of the century, because that was the fall 1911 revolution threw down the last dynasty. However, its territory population maintained the continuity after most radical revolution. And you see that from late 19th century down to the World War I, the Ottoman Empire disintegrated. World War I, after the Austro-Hungarian disintegrated later, and the Soviet Union was the Russian Empire collapsed. Then on that historical base, you have the Soviet Union. However, by 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. However, you can see that from 19th century empire to after the two revolutions, 1911, 1949, the territory, population, and a certain kind of the infrastructure and the system maintain the change. So that's how to explain the so-called continuity happened in one of the most radical revolution in the 20th century. That was the one issue. The second characteristic happened in the end of the 20th century, means that the Eastern Bloc, Soviet Eastern Bloc, collapsed. As Professor Dussel said, that now the Russia was totally different from the early the Soviet Union at all. This is the way. However, why China in the socialist era and the post-socialist era, the economic social relations are fundamentally transformed. However, the political structure remained unchanged, or not really unchanged, but it changed. But still, you can see the continuity between these two periods. So on the one hand, the Chinese reform is very radical. But on the other hand, you can find a process, historical unfolding process of the continuity to think about the role of China in contemporary world. Because if after 1911 revolution and the series of wars, China disintegrated, like Ottoman Empire is talking about China, then it's completely different. If China followed the Soviet Union or Eastern European bloc, collapsed in their ways, then it's also not possible to think about contemporary China. So these two characteristics of the China, the most radical revolution and the so-called the continuity, how can understand that the phenomena? I think it's very crucial to understand the role of China in this world.
Well, we have a lot of things in in my mind after your two presentations, particularly with this final part about the continuities and the change in the time about the political system and the economic change and how this could be complementary in a very unique way. But we have the time. Uh, for bueno, ha sido muy interesante la presentación. Quedan muchas cosas en el tintero, muchas ideas sueltas. Espero haber dado pie a que pues tengamos suficientes ideas acerca de la continuidad, ¿no? Y el cambio y cómo se complementan esta continuidad política que menciona el doctor Wang con el cambio económico, las ideas que nos ha dado el doctor Dussel sobre yo quedé particularmente, y de hecho creería que a raíz de los comentarios que vimos en la sección del chat, varias personas quedaron pensando en las empresas estatales y en la particularidad de que sean competitivas, de que generen ganancias, de que nos puedan honestamente dar una posibilidad de salida, al menos para pensar cómo podemos imaginar el sector público en América Latina. Me da la impresión de que fueron algunos de los tópicos relevantes y algunas de las ideas que el profesor Wang dio sobre el imperialismo, ¿no? Sobre la continuidad, sobre el desarrollo de larga duración de algunas de las ideas para entender el pensamiento chino contemporáneo. So, um, with no more things to discuss in the middle of everything, I will have to be very kind to you, Professor Wang, Professor Dussel. Very thanks for your assistance as a conferencist tonight here from Mexico. We are going to keep in touch. Y por el resto de nuestros asistentes, muchísimas gracias a nombre del comité organizador, del doctor Jaime Ortega, de un servidor. Em, Muchas gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy. Espero que les haya sido satisfactoria la presentación que hemos tenido y nos vemos el próximo martes a las 5 de la tarde, ahora sí, hora del centro de México. En la lista del chat ustedes pudieron ver dónde está la lista de inscripción para el registro de la asistencia y poder recibir su certificado de asistentes a nuestro evento. Y sin más, de nuevo, muchas gracias. Very thanks to you. So, nos estamos viendo. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, buenas tardes.
Okay, gracias. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.